A climber sets out for Everest carrying not only equipment, but also the weight of uncertainty. The biting ice, relentless winds, and deathly silence reveal a hostile landscape where every step is a challenge against his own body. He didn't know but his journey wouldn't be just a climb, but the beginning of a mystery frozen in time. Enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel to follow this story. The beginning of a climb is always a silent, almost cruel test. The thin air makes the lungs burn as if the body itself were on fire from within. Each breath becomes a battle, and the simple act of inhaling seems to steal more energy than it gives back. The climber knew this, but nothing prepared him for the feeling of being watched by the mountain itself, as if Everest had a conscience. His hands, covered in heavy gloves, trembled not only from the freezing cold, but from hidden fear. The ice beneath his feet creaked with each step, unstable, like a warning. You don't belong here. This is the first lesson the mountain imposes. Before any conquest, one must recognize human insignificance in the face of something so colossal. Fear, far from being a weakness, becomes a sign that life still pulses, that there is something to lose. The wind cut like invisible blades, and each gust seemed to want to tear away not only his physical balance but also his confidence. Many give up at this initial moment, when they realize that the romantic idea of adventure has become a brutal reality. It's no different from when someone begins a bold project in life, starting a business, changing careers, or taking on a personal challenge. In the first steps, enthusiasm clashes with the harshness of the environment, and the question arises almost inevitably, can I do it? Everest seemed to mock the climber, testing him with small obstacles, like rocks covered in slippery ice or treacherous cracks hidden beneath the snow. He found himself torn between the courage that drove him upward and the dread that tried to freeze him in place. In those moments, fear is not just an emotion, it is almost a physical presence, a shadow that accompanies every movement. The heart raced, not only from the effort, but from the veiled terror of a misstep. Everest, indifferent, didn't need to move a single stone to demonstrate its strength. The crushing silence was enough. The cold that stole heat in seconds was enough. This is the kind of experience that reveals the truth about any human being. When there is no audience, when there is no applause, when the only judge is one's own conscience. The climber, breathing heavily and taking shaky steps, knew he was in territory that doesn't forgive mistakes. But paradoxically, it was there that something greater was born, the spark of courage. Because fear can paralyze, but it can also be fuel. Just as a student uses anxiety before a test to focus, or an entrepreneur transforms insecurity into strength to innovate, the climber transformed that initial terror into a silent pact with himself. There were no guarantees of victory, only the promise to keep climbing, even if the mountain insisted on reminding him that each step was an affront to the impossible. On Everest, the unexpected is no exception, it's the rule. The climber knew that each step was a silent negotiation with death, but nothing prepared him for how quickly the scenario could change. A moment before, the blue sky seemed stable, like a rare breath of fresh air in that hostile environment. The next, heavy clouds formed on the horizon, carrying with them the omen of a storm. It was as if the mountain had decided to turn the hourglass of fate. The wind increased in intensity, throwing snowflakes at his face like sharp needles. The noise began to change too. That sepulchral silence transformed into a deafening roar, a sign that something was about to happen. And then, within seconds, the inevitable. An avalanche tore off one of the nearby slopes, descending in a whirlwind of ice and destruction. The scene seemed unreal, as if nature had transformed into a living creature, determined to devour everything in its path. The climber had no time to reflect. Instinct took over. Every muscle reacted in desperation, seeking shelter, grabbing ropes, trying to find any crevice that would keep him anchored to life. The snow surrounded him on all sides, the deafening sound drowning out his very breath. And yet, in that absolute chaos, something revealed itself. The mountain was not just a setting, but a character. It reacted, imposing limits, reminding him that daring too much was costly. Many would say it was bad luck, others, a lack of calculation. But the truth is, Everest doesn't need reasons to exact revenge. It simply exacts its toll. This first obstacle wasn't just physical, but psychological. The racing heart, the trembling body, the jumbled thoughts, everything seemed to conspire against the will to continue. This is when many give up, and not just on Everest. In life, an unexpected accident, a bankruptcy, a sudden loss can act like an avalanche, blanketing what once seemed like a clear path with uncertainty. The climber, however, chose to fight the urge to retreat. He knew that the difference between legend and oblivion lay precisely in these moments, when giving up seemed the most rational choice. And it's curious to note how human persistence, irrational as it may seem, has built entire civilizations. Cities built in deserts, airplanes flying against gravity, technologies born amidst wars. The drive to keep going, even in the face of the impossible, is what defines us. With each passing second, the avalanche diminished in intensity, until finally dissipating in a heavy silence, as if the mountain were satisfied. The exhausted climber looked up and realized that nothing would ever be the same. That wasn't just a scare, it was a warning. Everest had shown its claws and made it clear that it would not tolerate any slip-ups. The road was still long, but now it bore the mark of a turnaround. This is how narratives that captivate us work. Just when we believe everything is under control, something happens to tear us out of our comfort zone. It's at this point that the story changes color and the suspense intensifies. This impending catastrophe left scars that went beyond the body. There were scratches on the equipment, snow accumulated on the clothes, but above all, there was the psychological weight of knowing that nothing would be simple from then on. And this is a clear reflection of real life. How often are we forced to recalculate our route after an unforeseen event? An unexpected layoff can become the spark to start our own business. A broken relationship can push us towards self-discovery. A failure can teach us more than years of stability. The obstacle, however cruel it may seem, carries within it the seed of transformation. And the climber, still trembling but standing, was about to discover that surviving the avalanche was only the beginning of a journey that would become increasingly dark. Ultimately, the mountain tests not only physical endurance, but also the spirit. Every loose rock, every gust of wind, every avalanche is a question. Do you really deserve to reach the top? And as in any great narrative, the answer lies not in words, but in actions. The climber took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked up and saw the even more arduous path ahead, as if Everest, after the reversal, had placed an invisible barrier. From then on, it would not be just a climb, but a battle against the very essence of humanity. And it is at this point that the suspense intensifies, because what comes after the first great fall is never just recovery, it is transformation. The avalanche had passed, but what remained was not relief, but an even greater weight. The climber pressed on, now more aware that each step was not just progress, but pure survival. The thin air punished, making each breath a struggle against his own body. The oxygen, rarefied and treacherous, seemed to mock him, stealing strength while demanding double the effort. His throat burned, his lungs burned as if made of red-hot iron. With each breath, he felt as if he were inhaling more emptiness than air. And amidst this suffocation, there was the cold. A cold so biting that it not only hurt the skin, but seemed to bite into the bones. There was no room for comfort. Every muscle, every joint was a battlefield. And the mountain, indifferent, remained still, beautiful and cruel as a distant goddess. Time there was no longer his ally. The days passed in a blur, a sequence of freezing nights and colorless dawns. The sun, when it did appear, was more of an enemy than a relief, reflecting off the ice crystals and burning his eyes. The snow grew ever deeper, forcing the climber to expend energy he no longer had. His body began to show signs of collapse. Chapped lips, dried blood on his gums, fingers stiffening from the cold. He knew hypothermia was a constant threat, lurking like an invisible predator. And with every meter climbed, it wasn't just his body that gave way, but his mind too. Hazy thoughts arose, inner voices questioning, is it worth it? This is the phase when despair creeps in, silent, like water slowly freezing until it cracks. The stone. Determination was the only remaining flame, but even that was beginning to waver. The contrast between the climber and nature became more evident with each step. The mountain offered nothing. No drinking water, no food, no refuge, only snow, stone, and silence. And yet, it was in this brutal emptiness that man revealed his true essence. While many see despair as an enemy, the climber understood that it was also fuel. Because when the body screams that it can't take any more, the mind must decide, give in or resist. This choice isn't unique to mountaineers. It's repeated in every person facing financial crises, incurable illnesses, or devastating losses. It's easy to remain steadfast when the path is smooth. It's on life's steep climb that we discover who we truly are. But the mountain wasn't interested in life lessons. It demanded sacrifices. The climber knew that any distraction could spell doom, a misplaced step, a poorly secured rope, a second of carelessness, and the abyss would swallow him without remorse. Despair, at that point, ceased to be merely mental. It became physical, palpable. His heart raced, even when still, as if his body knew it was fighting biological limits. Extreme fatigue caused him to mistake hallucinations for reality. At times, he saw figures in the ice, as if invisible companions were following him. At others, he heard voices that weren't there, as if the mountain itself whispered cruel secrets. And yet he kept going. Because giving up meant freezing to death on the spot, and continuing, though nearly impossible, still offered a slim chance of survival. There was also the psychological side of isolation. Even surrounded by endless snow, the loneliness was deafening. The absence of other living beings reinforced the feeling of insignificance. It's like looking up at the night sky and realizing we're just a speck of dust in the universe. This realization, far from comforting, weighed like lead. The escalation of despair was not only physical but also philosophical. The climber wondered, amidst the pain, what's the point of it all? And this question echoed, not only on the ice, but within him. Perhaps it's the same question so many ask in times of crisis. The executive who loses everything in bankruptcy, the father struggling with a child's illness, the student who finds themselves lost without direction. Everest, in this sense, is pure metaphor, an amplified representation of the mountains each of us faces in life. And as he advanced, each step seemed slower, as if time had become a dense mass. The clock made no sense there, only the cadence of his footsteps, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, the crack of his labored breath. Desperation, paradoxically, also brought a kind of clarity. He began to understand that the mountain could not be conquered, only endured. And this realization became at once terrifying and liberating. Because if the summit was unreachable, then every meter conquered was already a victory. It was a cruel, but true logic. Surviving another day was already a triumph over death. This slow, wrenching climb of despair shaped the climber into something different from the man who began the journey. His features were harder, his eyes deeper, his body weaker. But there was something new there, a raw, almost savage intensity. He was no longer climbing just to reach the summit. He was climbing because there was no alternative. It was either climb or be swallowed by nothingness. And this is the point at which the narrative grips those who follow. There is no longer any looking back, no stopping. The only way is up, even if each step costs pieces of one's own soul. And so the mountain tested him, pushing him to the limit of the unbearable. The climb to despair was no longer measured in meters, but in heartbeats, in ragged breaths, in moments stolen from death. And as the snow continued to fall, covering tracks and erasing stories, the audience following this story began to sense that something greater was about to happen. Because on Everest, when the body can no longer take it and the mind verges on breaking, that's precisely when the most brutal twists and turns emerge. On Everest, solitude is illusory, even when it seems like only snow and wind exist. There is always the invisible presence of others, fellow travelers, climbing rivals, voices of command or resistance. The climber was not completely alone. There were others on the expedition, each carrying their own battle, their own motivations, and it is in this coexistence that conflicts arise. One of them was the more experienced companion, who eyed the climber with suspicion, trying to convince him that turning back was the wisest choice. This man didn't speak simply out of fear. He spoke with the voice of experience, of someone who had seen bodies lost in the snow and never found again. But there was also the obstinate expedition leader who insisted on continuing. For him, retreat was unacceptable. He believed that the group's glory depended on pushing forward, no matter the cost. This clash of ideas fueled silent tensions. The more cautious companion saw in the leader an arrogance that could doom them all. The leader, in turn, saw prudence as weakness. And the climber, in the midst of all this, had to choose who to listen to: the voice of reason or the voice of ambition. This dilemma isn't exclusive to the mountains. In everyday life, the same thing happens when friends, family, and co-workers offer conflicting advice. Some urge caution, others to take risks. Deciding who to believe can be as exhausting as the climb itself. On Everest, however, the difference between listening to right or wrong advice can cost one's life. The conflicts weren't just external. Within the group itself, the psychological aspect became a battleground. There were those who envied the climber's strength, and there were those who saw him as a burden. In critical moments, small actions revealed great truths. One companion shared the last protein bar, while another hid extra water in his backpack. These almost invisible details transformed into narratives of trust or betrayal. And the climber, tired and vulnerable, absorbed it all. In the extreme cold, there was no room for social masks. the mountain ripped the essence from each person. Those who were generous showed themselves even more. Those who were selfish let it show without disguise. The psychological weight of these conflicts heightened the suspense. The climber felt that, beyond the snow and wind, he had to fight against the human voices competing in his mind. The cautious companion appeared as an internal echo of his own insecurity. The obstinate leader represented his original ambition, the one that had driven him to leave home to face Everest. It was as if his own consciousness had split into two flesh-and-blood characters, each pushing him in opposite directions. The mountain, silent, simply watched the clash. The suspense lay not only in the cold, the avalanches or the chasms, but also in this human theater, where every word could become a sentence. These dilemmas between reason and ambition, prudence and daring, show that on Everest, physical strength is not enough. The body can endure for a few days, but it is the mind that determines who continues and who gives up. The climber understood that he didn't just need to climb the mountain, he needed to survive the invisible war of choices. And amid these silent struggles, the public begins to realize that the real danger lies not only in the ice threatening to give way, but in the human decisions that will shape the expedition's fate. At this point in the climb, the climber was no longer the same man who had left base camp full of bravery and plans. Everest has this ability to mold, or rather, shatter, what seemed solid. The endless hours in the extreme cold, the winds that screamed like a chorus of trapped souls, and his body screaming in pain, drew from him a raw, unmasked version. Each step was a bitter revelation. He was no longer competing against other climbers or trying to prove something to the world, but against himself. With each ascent, with each crevasse crossed, he realized that the true enemy was not the mountain. It was his mind, oscillating between courage and collapse. These revelations came not in clear internal discourses, but in fragments. He would gaze at the snow covering the tracks of ancient climbers and wonder if years from now someone would pass by and find his body frozen, intact as an ice statue. This vision, far from frightening him, sometimes brought him a strange serenity, as if accepting fate were easier than fighting it. But at other times, this same thought turned into a confrontation. Why am I here? What brought me to this point where life is worth so little? These questions echoed like a hammer in his mind, taking away the little rest he still managed to squeeze out during the brief pauses. The conflict also grew in his relationship with his fellow expedition members. The leader, increasingly obsessed, forced the team to continue, even when clear signs of exhaustion appeared. He saw in this man's eyes an almost insane obstinacy, as if the summit were more important than their own lives. His cautious companion, who insisted on returning, now seemed more desperate, repeating that continuing was suicide. These clashes became increasingly tense, turning the snow into a stage for hushed arguments. The climber in the middle wavered between the two, but was no longer sure if his voice still mattered. It was as if the mountain had dissolved human hierarchies and reduced everyone to mere survivors. The most brutal revelation, however, was not in others, but in himself. The climber began to realize that his initial confidence was nothing more than fragile armor corroded by wind and ice. The deathly silence of the snow, covering footprints and erasing trails, revealed that no one was remembered for long in this place. Everest held no memories, only bodies. This realization struck him like a direct confrontation. He was not invincible, he was not special, He was just another man facing a mountain that had devoured so many others before him. These internal and external confrontations created unbearable tension. Every decision seemed final. Continuing meant risking collapse. Retreating meant accepting defeat. There was no middle ground. The fight was no longer just against the cold, against shortness of breath, against fatigue. It was against one's own ego, against the idea that victory was necessary at any cost. The audience following this account realizes at this point that the climb has ceased to be an adventure and has become a painful meditation on human frailty. And like every good story, the answers are still unanswered. Because on Everest, each revelation opens the door to even more brutal confrontations, which only the mountain itself can impose. The climax came like a whisper, turned into a scream. After days of struggle, the climber no longer walked. He crawled. His body was a fragile shell, his mind a battlefield, and the mountain a ruthless judge. It was then that the final contact occurred. A radio crackled, his voice broken, almost swallowed by the wind. "I'm still climbing." Minutes later, the signal faded, leaving only icy silence in response. His remaining companions knew what this meant. On Everest, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the confirmation that the mountain has swallowed another one. The wind picked up, roaring as if celebrating victory. Snowflakes swirled through the air and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The climber was alone, advancing blindly, and the storm surrounded him like a patient predator. His steps were heavy, trembling, growing shorter. At one point he screamed. A scream that was not just of pain, but of despair and fury against the inevitable. That sound, lost in the gale, perhaps never heard by anyone, but it echoed like a milestone. The exact moment a man was swallowed by legend. The narrative camera, if it existed, would freeze there, a small figure, swallowed by a colossal storm. There was no farewell. There was no applause, no witnesses. Only the mountain and its eternal silence. The climber disappeared like so many before him, becoming yet another mystery guarded by the ice. For those watching from the outside, the climax is not only the tragedy of his disappearance, but the final revelation: Everest is not conquered. It only allows some to tell part of their story before disappearing into its depths. The man, swallowed by the snow, left behind an invisible trail of courage, madness, and sacrifice. 5 decades have passed since its disappearance. Everest remained there, untouched as always, silently guarding the secrets of those who dared to challenge it. But the mountain sometimes gives back what it took. It was during a research expedition that a group found something unusual: pieces of blue fabric emerging from the hardened ice. Digging revealed the motionless figure of a man, clothes intact, equipment frozen, body preserved by the cold as if he had fallen there only yesterday. It was the climber, finally restored to history. The shock of the discovery spread around the world. Newspapers printed his crystallized image, and old accounts were revisited. For his surviving companions, now elderly, this revelation was not just a fact, but a settling of accounts. The mountain had kept the secret for half a century, but now it returned a body that was not just physical, it was symbolic. It represented courage, stubbornness, but also human fragility in the face of nature. The respect he never received in life now emerged in the form of tributes, books, and documentaries. In that frozen scene, there was a sense of justice. Not human justice, meted out in courtrooms, but the slow, silent justice of memory. The climber, who had departed anonymously and been swallowed by the wind, now became a legend. His motionless body spoke louder than 1,000 speeches. It reminded him that Everest does not forgive, but neither does it forget. Once found, he was no longer just another missing person. He became a symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between man and mountain. The reunion with the climbers' body was not only an archaeological discovery of the mountain, but a profound blow to collective memory. Seeing him preserved by the ice, many felt as if time had stopped, as if his last breath still echoed on the wind. The outcome brought not only answers, but also a disturbing reflection. How far is the line between courage and madness? What moves someone to risk everything before a mountain that never promised anything in return? Everest, in this sense, reveals itself as a metaphor for life itself. Some climb it seeking glory, others out of an obsession with proving something to themselves. But the mountain, indifferent, reminds us that no conquest is definitive. It teaches us that each step has its price, and that some pay with their very existence. The climber didn't conquer Everest, but neither was he defeated. He became part of its history, inscribed in the eternal silence of the snow. And perhaps this is his greatest legacy. The disappearance, the half-century wait, and the final revelation make up a narrative that transcends adventure and touches on the human. Remembering this man frozen in time, we realize that life is not measured solely by what we achieve, but by what we are willing to face. And Everest, majestic and cruel, remains there, like a relentless guardian, allowing some to tell their story before they are lost in the infinite white.